Three tiny rubber rafts, tied together, rise and fall on an ocean that goes to the horizon in every direction, and in them 8 men are slowly dying. It is somewhere in the Central Pacific in the autumn of 1942. There is no land in sight, and there has not been for days, and there will not be for many more. The men have no fresh water, their food ran out long ago. The sun burns them by day, and the cold wrings them by night. Sharks bump the bottoms of the raft, and one by one the younger men are giving up, drifting toward the quiet welcoming death that thirst and despair offer at the end. By every rule of survival, these men should already be gone. They will be out here, on the open sea, for 24 days. And the reason most of them will live to tell us about it is the oldest man in the rafts, a 52-year-old with a broken body and an iron will, whose name every American in 1942 already knew. He was Eddie Rickenbacker, and in 1942 he was a living legend. In the First World War, he had been America's greatest fighter ace, the ace of aces, with more aerial victories than any other American pilot, a Medal of Honor, and a fame that had never faded. Now, in this new war, at an age when most men were long past such things, he had been sent on a secret mission across the Pacific for the War Department, and his aircraft, a B-17 Flying Fortress, had gotten hopelessly lost, run its tanks dry, and been forced to ditch in the open ocean. 8 men had scrambled out of the sinking bomber and into the rafts, and then the sea had them. Their situation was as close to hopeless as a situation can be. They were somewhere in a vast, empty stretch of the Pacific, far off any expected course, which meant that no one searching for them would even know where to look. They had almost nothing, a few oranges, some fishing line, a little gear, and no water at all in a place where water was the only thing that mattered. The rafts were small and thin and crowded, and the ocean they floated on was so enormous, and they were so tiny upon it, that the odds of anyone ever spotting 3 specks of rubber were almost too small to calculate. What kept them alive out there for more than 3 weeks is a chain of events so unlikely that if it were not documented, no one would believe it. And at the center of it was Rickenbacker, the old ace, the most experienced and the toughest man aboard. He had already, over a long and violent life, survived things that should have killed him, including a horrific airliner crash the year before that had left him broken and scarred. He did not intend to die on a raft. More than that, he did not intend to let the young men around him die, and the way he set about keeping them alive was so harsh, so relentless, that some of them hated him for it. That hatred, it would turn out, was part of the plan. Before we go further, if stories like this one matter to you, please take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep the memory of these men alive and reach more people who care about them. Thank you. Now, back to the rafts, and to the first terrible days on the open sea. The first days were a slow torture. The tropical sun blistered their skin and baked the water out of them, and with nothing to drink, thirst became a form of madness. They tried to ration the few oranges. They watched the horizon for ships and planes that never came. Sharks, some of them large, circled the little rafts and bumped against them, and the men, weakening by the hour, had no way to drive them off. And as the days piled up with no rescue and no water, the despair set in, especially among the younger men, who began to slip into the dull, fatal apathy that kills survivors as surely as thirst does, the giving up that comes just before the end. Rickenbacker would not allow it. He was the oldest and the most battered of them, and he took command of the rafts by sheer force of personality, and he fought the men's despair the only way he knew, by refusing to let them rest in it. He goaded them, he mocked them, he cursed them savagely, told them they were too weak and stupid and worthless to survive, dared them to prove him wrong, kept at them hour after hour when they only wanted to be left alone to die. It was brutal, and it was deliberate. He had understood something about the human animal, that a man too tired to live for himself will sometimes stay alive out of pure spite, and so he gave them someone to hate and made that someone the thing that kept their hearts beating. Rickenbacker set a discipline over the rafts as hard as iron. When they still had the few oranges, he rationed them with a miser's precision, a sliver at a time, making them last impossibly long, refusing to let anyone give in to the craving to devour everything at once. He had been close to death before and knew what it demanded. Only the year before, he had survived a commercial airliner crash so severe that it had left him broken and near death, and he had clawed his way back, and that had burned into him a certain knowledge, that the body can endure far more than the mind believes, if only the mind refuses to quit. He would not let these men's minds quit. That was the whole of his strategy, and out there it was the only one that mattered. And then came the moment that no one who tells this story can quite believe, and that is completely documented. About a week in, as Rickenbacker lay with his hat over his face in the blazing sun, a seagull, out of an empty sky, hundreds of miles from any land, landed on his head. He knew exactly what it meant. Very slowly, without a sound, he raised his hand, and he caught it. That single bird became food, shared out among 8 starving men, and its remains became bait. And with that bait they caught fish, and the fish gave them more food and precious moisture. A seabird had appeared from nowhere and delivered them, at the moment they needed it most. And to a religious man like Rickenbacker, it was nothing less than deliverance. The reprieves kept coming, barely, at the edge of too late. Rain squalls swept over them, and the men learned to catch the water in their clothing and their gear, wringing out a few desperate mouthfuls, hoarding it. They caught more fish, and through all of it Rickenbacker drove them, kept them bailing, kept them fishing, kept them watching, kept them furious at him, and therefore alive, day after day after day, as 1 week became 2 and 2 began to stretch toward 3. But the ocean took its toll even so. The youngest and most weakened of them, a man already ill before the crash, slipped away despite everything, and the survivors, with what little strength and ceremony they had, gave him to the sea. The rest of them were running out of time, and they knew it. As the second week bled into the third, the ordeal narrowed to a single grinding contest between the men's failing bodies and their commander's refusal to release them. Their skin had burned and split, their bodies had wasted, their minds had begun to drift toward the edge of coherence, and every hour was a fresh negotiation with the urge to simply stop. Rickenbacker held the line. He kept them to their tasks, kept them watching for the next fish, the next cloud that might bring rain, the next reason to make it to nightfall, and then from nightfall to dawn. Survival out there was not one heroic act. It was 10,000 small refusals to die, strung end to end, across day after identical, merciless day, and he stood over every one of them. By now the rafts had drifted apart, the men splitting into separate groups on the current, each little band alone on the enormous sea. The search for them had been going on for weeks, across a stretch of ocean so vast that the effort was nearly abandoned as hopeless more than once. But the searchers kept flying, and at last, after more than 3 weeks, a patrol plane spotted one of the specks of rubber against all odds, and then the others, and the rescue began. 24 days after their bomber went into the water, the survivors were pulled from the Pacific, sunburned to leather, skeletal, some near death, but alive. They had lost one man, and the rest of them had come within a hair of the same end, again and again, for over 3 weeks. Rickenbacker himself had lost an enormous amount of weight and was in terrible shape, but he was alive. And so were most of his men, and everyone who examined the ordeal afterward came to the same conclusion, that they had lived because of him, because the tough old ace had refused, with his goading and his fury and his sheer unbreakable will, to let a single one of them quietly quit. Cruelty had been a kind of love. It had kept them breathing until the sea and the seagull and the searchers finally gave them back their lives. The story of Eddie Rickenbacker's 24 days on the Pacific became a national sensation, one more impossible chapter in a life already full of them. He had been the ace of aces, he had survived crashes and wars and a peacetime disaster, and now he had beaten the open ocean itself, and dragged most of his men through it with him. He lived another 3 decades after those rafts, a legend many times over, but the survival at sea remained one of the most extraordinary things he ever did, precisely because so much of it came down not to flying or fighting, but to the plain refusal to die. That is the whole story, and its heart is a hard and beautiful thing. Out on an empty ocean, with no water and no hope and death, arriving quietly for the week, an old man decided that his men were going to live whether they wanted to or not. And he made himself the enemy of their despair, and he won. The seagull was a miracle, and the rain was a mercy, and the searchers were a wonder. But the thing that actually kept those men alive, hour by hour, through 24 days that should have finished them, was one stubborn, furious, aging hero who would not let go, and would not let them go either. That is what will keep them alive. And it is why, more than 80 years later, the story is still almost impossible to believe, and still worth telling.